Welcome to the Veritas podcast, the show where we study and discuss papal writings of the Catholic Church. Welcome, this is the Veritas podcast. He's Rob, I'm Robert. We come to the end of Libertas after 15 episodes. We've been talking about Libertas as the idea of liberty or freedom. We've talked about how the Church leads us to true freedom by following its rules, its guidelines, and how those sinners who don't follow the guidelines waver and they get way off the path. They think that that's true freedom. In reality, enslavement comes from following sin. These people are called liberals, and Rob's going to talk about that in a moment. But think about the idea of following your passions and becoming a slave to them versus following Christ's church. Pope Leo really talked about this extensively, so I really encourage people to go back and listen to the episodes that they thought were best. So, Rob, can you help us understand this idea of liberalism and liberals and how that applies to the encyclical as a whole?
Yeah, what I thought we could do in our last episode is just kind of review briefly what liberalism is. We've gone over it in specifics, but I thought we could just kind of give a general idea of what liberalism is in this final episode. So liberalism is essentially, it's a denial of the sovereignty of God over men. And as we discussed in the last few episodes when we've talked about the speculative and the practical intellect, liberalism can be a denial on the doctrinal level, or it can be a denial of God's sovereignty on the practical level, or both. On the doctrinal level, liberalism denies that all men have an obligation to accept the truths that God has revealed. On the practical level, it denies that men have the duty to obey God's law. It claims that men instead have a right to break God's law, especially the first commandment, which forbids false religions. And with the liberals, everything is inverted and reoriented away from God and towards man. They ignore the rights of God and focus exclusively on a false notion of the rights of man. And they ignore the sovereignty of God and replace it with the sovereignty of man. And you'll always hear them talk about the sovereignty of man. And they ignore the will of God and replace it exclusively with the will of man. And this takes place, these errors take place on the individual level with man and also on the social level with society. And there was a book written by a priest at the end of the 19th century called Liberalism Is a Sin. It's an excellent book. The liberals at the time, they objected to the book and sent it to the Holy Office to review. The Holy Office reviewed the book and actually highly recommended the book. It's an excellent book dealing with the errors of liberalism, and it's a book that really everyone should read that's interested in this subject. But he defines liberalism as the complete independence of the individual reason, which is man, and the social reason, which is the community, from the eternal reason of God. This is how he put it in the book. Quote, liberalism is the dogmatic affirmation of the absolute independence of the individual and the social reason. Catholicity is the dogma of the absolute subjection of the individual and the social order to the revealed law of God. One doctrine is the exact antithesis of the other. They are opposites in direct conflict, unquote. And then he goes on to say, quote, liberalism, whether in the doctrinal or practical order, is a sin. In the doctrinal order, it is heresy, and consequently, a mortal sin against faith. In the practical order, it is a sin against the commandments of God and of the church. And then a little farther on he says, Liberalism denies the necessity of divine revelation and the obligation of everyone to accept that revelation under pain of eternal perdition. It denies, he says, the formal motive for faith, namely the authority of God revealing, and admits only as much of revealed doctrine as it chooses or comprehends within its own narrow capacity. Then going to the practical level, he says, when we come to the practical order, liberalism is radical immorality. Morality, he says, requires a standard and a guide to rational action. In the moral order, the eternal reason alone can be the principle or fundamental rule of action. And this eternal reason is God. And the moral order, determine its course, must guide itself by the light of the uncreated reason, who is the beginning and end of all things. The law, therefore, imposed by the eternal reason upon the creature, hence obedience and submission in the moral order, is an absolute requisite of morality. But liberalism has proclaimed the absurd principle of the absolute sovereignty of human reason. It denies any reason beyond itself and asserts its independence in the order of knowledge and hence in the order of action or morality. Here we have morality without law, without order, freedom to do what one pleases. Liberalism in the order of action is license, recognizing no principle or rule beyond itself, unquote.
Rob, you made a pretty good point earlier when you were talking about how liberalism is the direct opposite, or it's in direct conflict of God and his moral law. What do you think, though? Do you think somebody can be a liberal Catholic?
No. Well, liberalism, the principles of liberalism are exactly the opposite of Catholicism. Now, there are liberal Catholics today. Pius IX, he said a liberal Catholic is the worst enemy of the Catholic Church. Now, due to the situation that we all live in today, we're all influenced to a degree by liberalism. Every one of us are influenced to a degree, some more than others. But in my experience, it's those that are hardened in the liberal errors that are almost incurable. There was a book written in the 1920s called Liberalism and Catholicism by a priest, and he makes that same point. He said the sin of liberalism is almost incurable, and I've found that myself. Liberals who adhere to these principles with pertinacity, they know what the church teaches, but they adhere to the principles of liberalism anyway, they're almost incurable. So you cannot be a true, genuine Catholic and adhere to the principles of liberalism at the same time, because they're opposites. They're the exact opposites. Liberalism is basically, it's a repeat of the sin that Lucifer committed when he said to God, non serviam, I will not serve. It's the opposite. Catholicism is the subjection of man to God. Liberalism seeks to free man from his obedience due to God. So it's the two are the exact opposite. Leo XIII in Libertas, in the paragraph that we didn't read in our study, he made the same point I just did. He said that liberalism is a repeat of the sin of Lucifer. This is what he said in paragraph 14, which we didn't read. He said, quote, but many there are who follow in the footsteps of Lucifer and adopt as their own his rebellious cry, I will not serve, and consequently substitute for true liberty what is sheer and most foolish license. Such, for instance, are the men belonging to that widely spread and powerful organization who, usurping the name of liberty, style themselves liberals. So Lucifer rose up against God, and the liberals rise up against Christ the King, who is God incarnate. The liberal Catholics reject the sovereignty of Christ over nations. They might say, oh, yes, Christ should be the king of our hearts, but when it comes to Christ being the king of nations and saying nations also must submit to Christ the King, they won't go there. They deny the sovereignty of Christ the King over the nations. Basically,
And yeah,
right now.
and Rob, Leo has discussed this as well in the encyclical we've studied about these people who will actually admit that God even exists, which is against some of the atheists we talked about. But then they say, well, he can exist in church, or he can exist in my heart. These are those politicians who follow their conscience, so to speak, and are not really pro-life, that kind of thing.
Right. They deny the temporal kingship of Christ. And we've talked about the problems in the church today. The church is in apostasy. It's the passion of the church. What we're going through right now in the passion of the church is the mystical body of Christ right now is enduring. It's going through what happened on Calvary. There's a repeat taking place. So what happened on Calvary? The chosen people, the true religion at the time, they rejected Christ. When Pilate brought Christ out and said to the Jews, who were, again, that was the true religion at the time, Pilate said, "Behold your king." What did the Jews say? They said, "We will not have this man to reign over us. We have no king but Caesar." They only wanted the temporal authorities. They would not have Christ reign over them. And that is exactly what the liberal Catholics today say. We will not have this man to reign over us. And then what did the Jews say? They said, "Give unto us Barabbas." Well, what are the liberal Catholics saying today? The same thing. Give unto us Barabbas. The Bible tells us that Barabbas was a murderer and a thief. Now, when I read this, if you look at what the popes since Paul VI have done, they have turned, they've rejected the kingship of Christ over nations, and who they turn to. They turn to the modern day Barabbas, the modern day murderer and thief, the United Nations. Paul VI gave his papal tiara to the United Nations. The tiara signifies his threefold authority. He gave that to the United Nations. And in 1965, in a speech to the United Nations, this is what Paul VI said, quote, he said, "The people of the earth turn to the United Nations as the last hope of concord and peace." So you see the liberals in the hierarchy have rejected the social reign of Christ the King and have instead called for Barabbas, the United Nations. So we see there's an exact parallel of what took place 2,000 years ago happening all over again. The true religion is rejecting Christ, just like it did 2,000 years ago.
It's really kind of sad to see how blatantly and obvious it is, and yet people refuse to see it. They don't want to serve, and they don't want to behave as they claim to believe. If I believe in Christ, then prove it and behave that way. That's how it goes for anybody. It's just too hard, though, to submit, and that's what makes them liberals.
Yeah. Let me tell you what, this is just my personal opinion on what I think is taking place and what I think is going to happen in the future. Again, this is just my personal opinion. Anyone's free to disagree. But when the Jews rejected Christ, if you read Romans chapter 11, St. Paul says, yes, the Jews rejected Christ, and because of their rejection of Christ, God turned to the Gentiles. Okay, he says that. God turned to the Gentiles because the Jews rejected them. Okay? Well, now, today, what's happening? Today, the Gentiles are rejecting Christ. Okay? Today, the Gentiles are doing what the Jews did 2,000 years ago. So what I think is going to happen, and this also fits in with what is supposed to happen in the future, I think that now that the Gentiles are rejecting Christ, I think he's going to turn back to the Jews. That's my opinion. He's going to turn back to the Jews, but it's not going to be like it was 2,000 years ago. 2,000 years ago, the Jews rejected Christ, so God turned to the Gentiles and abandoned the Jews. What I think we're about to see, the Gentiles today are rejecting Christ. God's going to turn back to the Jews, but in turning back to the Jews, the Gentiles are also going to convert. So I think that is what's about to take place. We're entering into the sixth age of the church coming up pretty soon. I think the sixth age is going to bring about the conversion of the Jews, which has been predicted to take place soon, the conversion of the Jews, and it's due to the apostasy of the Gentiles, which is taking place right now. But then again, like I said, the Jews convert, God doesn't abandon the Gentiles also convert, and now you have the full worldwide conversion that ushers in then the sixth age of the church. That's my personal opinion on how it's going to play out, but I guess time will tell.
Now, what we've been talking about, though, is modernism throughout most of this encyclical, and we've just been talking about this episode, liberalism. And liberalism is kind of like a wrecking ball to the church's structure. So you have one set of construction workers come in and they tear down the place because they don't like what's there, and that's the liberalism. But Rob, isn't there a second step to this process?
Yeah, that's how the relation between liberalism and modernism. The way I usually explain the relation to myself is that, like you said, liberalism tore down. Now, liberalism and modernism are interlinked, but I usually understand liberalism as that which tore down the Christian order, that which turned people away from Christ. It tore down. But then what modernism does is it then rebuilds something else in its place. So liberalism tore down the true religion, Christendom, but then modernism comes in and it replaces it with a false religion, with something else, with the religion of man. So yeah, that's the way I understand personally the relation between the two. Liberalism tore down, modernism builds up a false religion in its place. Liberalism tore down the religion of God, modernism builds up the religion of man.
And finally, to kind of bookend this entire encyclical, we were talking about natural liberty and supernatural liberty as well. Can you kind of bring us back full circle to the idea that we're not truly free by being liberal?
Yes. True freedom, we talked about early on, is the freedom to do what we ought to do, not just what we want to do. It's the freedom that submits our lower nature to our higher nature, which is our reason. So the true freedom then is the freedom to act according to our right reason, to be free from vice, to be free from sin, that's the effect of our lower nature, but also to be free from intellectual error. So we can be entangled, we can be enslaved in two ways. We can be enslaved by our lower nature, by vices, someone's a drug addict or they're addicted to impurity, that's one way. But you can also be enslaved to error. And Catholicism frees you from both. It frees you from error by filling your mind with the truth when you believe the truth by faith, and then it will free you from your vices by grace. Grace, when it's cooperated with, will free the person gradually from their vices. Then the person can live according to right reason, doing what they ought to do. That is actually what true liberty is, as opposed to false liberty, which is, I'm going to do whatever I want to do. It may not be the right thing, but it's what I want to do at this time. That's the false notion of liberty. I'm going to do what I want to do, regardless of what's true, what's not true. I'm just going to do what I want to do and in this particular moment.
Pope Leo talked about all the different problems of modernism in the encyclical, and he says the solution, as you said, Rob, is sound doctrine, sound Catholic doctrine. Number one, to free your mind. You can't get grace if you're outside the church anyway, so you need to understand and learn the truths of the Catholic faith, assent to them with your will, and then grace will come after that. And so I think Pope Leo sums it up best by explaining it that way. That's kind of the remedy or the treatment for what ails society today. Well, that's it. We come to the end of Libertas. Our next encyclical that Rob and I are going to be studying will be Pascendi. It's on the doctrine of the modernists, and that's how we kind of planned it as kind of the sequel, in a sense, to these last 15 episodes or so. Pope Pius X wrote it on September 8th, 1907. So for those of you all that would like to follow along, I'd encourage you to read it. I use papalencyclicals.net, but you can find it all over the place. We'll try to do maybe the first 3 paragraphs or so next time. So if you want to be prepared or want to follow with us, I'd recommend that. What we'll do, though, to end this episode is to play a small recording of Pope Leo XIII. He's the first pope to ever be recorded with audio, and you can hear him. And so we'll play that. It's pretty neat to hear as we go out this time. Rob, it's been a pleasure.
Okay, Robert, I enjoyed it, and I look forward to doing the shindy.
Santa Maria, Mater Dei, ora pro nobis peccatoribus, nunc et in hora mortis nostre. Amen.